Okay, well, thank you very much, Commissioner Kreidler, for the invitation to be part of the 2021 Climate Summit. It's certainly a pleasure to be here this afternoon for this event. So today I'm going to be focused on, I will be speaking on the specific theme of addressing the protection gap. And I will use the time to focus on four main things. The first being share a little bit of information with you on the Insurance Development Forum and its purpose. Secondly, I will then offer a few reflections on the protection gap and why it's so relevant at this time, particularly given what we are seeing across the world with disasters and also the recent release of the IPCC report. Third, I will also share a little bit of insight in terms of what we're seeing as it relates to innovative ideas emerging in terms of how insurance can help to address this protection gap. And then finally, offer some thoughts and reflections, which I hope can inform some of the subsequent discussions and exchanges that we can have. So with that, the Insurance Development Forum is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry, but supported by international organizations. It was first announced at the UNFCCC COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015, but officially launched in 2016 by the insurance industry and co-chaired by the World Bank as well as the United Nations. Our aim is to optimize and extend the use of insurance and related risk management capabilities to build resilience and protection for people, businesses, communities, from disasters and economic shocks. Currently, we have 5 working groups that really speak, I believe, to the core areas that we should be focused on when we think about the protection gap and the needs that are out there. The first being on risk modeling and really working as a public sector and private sector working together to improve the availability of risk information and risk insights. Our second area of focus is on law, regulation, and resilience policies, which I know will resonate with this community. And we have 2 working groups that are focused on really designing new solutions. And this is a sovereign and humanitarian working group, as well as an inclusive insurance working group. And then finally, thinking about insurers on both sides of the balance sheets, not only in terms of their underwriting capacity, but also on the investment side, really thinking about how we can increase the investments that insurers are making in terms of in infrastructure, particularly in emerging markets. And so we have over 200 experts working actively over these 5 working groups to help to address, again, this overarching problem that we see as it relates to the protection gap. The second slide in my presentation just gives you an overview of the members of the IDF. So you will see not only the large insurance and reinsurance companies and brokers, but also very much a public sector presence within the IDF. So for example, the German government sits on our steering committee, as well as I mentioned earlier, the United Nations, the UNDP, the World Bank, and others. So getting to the heart of the conversation that we are here to have today, which is the focus on the protection gap, and obviously how that converges with climate change. I think that most of us are very well familiar with some of the big figures that are often referenced when we think about the protection gap. And in this slide, you see the figure of 162.5 billion. And this is an assessment from Lloyd's of the size of the global insurance protection gap in emerging economies. This also sits against the backdrop where we have 1%, just 1%, of natural disaster losses in developing countries between the period of 1980 to 2004 being insured. And this is quite a stark difference when you compare it to most developed markets where we're talking about usually losses, you have 30% being covered by insurance. And again, another important, I think, element of the work that we do and a reflection on this theme is that a lot of the losses that we are seeing in terms of climate and disasters, most of that is simply not insured in many developing countries. So the protection gap, when we think about it, is an issue in developing countries, but I think that, again, it's also an issue that we see in many developed countries as well. And what is particularly concerning is the fact that oftentimes those people who actually need the most protection are often the ones who are not able to access insurance. And so for us, this, I think, is one of the pressing issues that we need to really reflect on when we think about the impacts of climate change, but also how our world has sought to deal with the impact of COVID-19. The next slide is just to give you a little bit more context when we think about the protection gap and the absence, I would say, of insurance in many of these communities and the context within which that occurs. So for many developing countries, when you do have a disaster, there is usually a need for some kind of humanitarian financing support. And that's some financing from international donors to help to support response and recovery efforts. But the challenge that we see is that the humanitarian or the global humanitarian system is actually significantly underfunded. So what that means is that when you do have these disasters, the system is quite, I think, difficult to mobilize the resources that are actually needed for those communities that have been impacted. So oftentimes, what happens is that individuals, poor people have to absorb these shocks. So it means quite a significant impact in terms of loss of lives, but also loss of livelihoods. And so what we essentially have is a situation where there is a mismatch between the commitment to protect and actually the availability of financing to support interventions. There was a study which was done recently by the Center for Disaster Protection. And one of the most revealing elements of that study was that just 2% of global funding was planned and arranged in advance in terms of the COVID-19 response. So I think that that really sheds quite a remarkable light on the kinds of deficiencies that we are seeing when we think about the availability of ex-ante instruments to support governments, people who have to deal with these shocks on an increasingly more regular basis. Another element of this is also the challenge of looking at infrastructure investments that are being made in many of these countries. Infrastructure obviously is an essential ingredient for the success of a modern economy, has positive impacts in terms of output, productivity, and just fundamental for long-term growth. And a lot of these governments are actually investing significant resources in terms of infrastructure, both at the sovereign and sub-sovereign level. But what we're also seeing is that there is an increasing need to think about how are we actually protecting these investments that we are making in terms of infrastructure, because they're so critical for our long-term development objectives. And this is particularly challenging because whilst they're making these investments, there are also significant threats when we think about disasters that could occur and the rollbacks that actually would be incurred as a result of damage to critical infrastructural investments. So this for us is actually quite a big issue when we start to engage many of our governments around the question of the protection gap, and looking at the investments that they're making in infrastructure and the need for a greater resilience and protection for those investments. So in thinking about this problem, what is clear is that insurance has an important role to play. But it is not only about insurance, it's also about the broader risk management solutions that are actually needed. But insurance can actually be quite an important contributor in terms of helping to address or bring to the fore the solutions that are required. Because when we think about it, there is a need for better information, a need to improve availability of information and understanding of the risks that governments or people and communities, businesses, etc., actually face. And this is so fundamental and germane to the insurance industry. And so there's an opportunity there for industry and basic fundamentals that exist within the industry to bring greater transparency to these risks. Another area that I think is quite important that insurance can play a critical role when we think about the protection gap is also in driving prevention and risk reduction. When we have a better understanding of what the risks are, there's also an opportunity to have more robust conversations around the investments that we're making in risk reduction and risk mitigation activities. And similarly for disaster response and how we structure that. And then fundamentally, there's also the value of insurance in terms of just making financing available to people once they have been affected by a disaster. So there are a multiplicity of fronts in which the value proposition of insurance can really be, or is especially relevant at this time when we think about climate and some of the more complex risks that are emerging. And so what we're seeing on a global front is actually the issue of the protection gap, but also the role of insurance really rising on the global agenda, and the global climate agenda and just the global development agenda. And so one of the things that has been quite interesting over the past year that has emerged is, for example, the G7 earlier this year in their communique made very specific reference again to the need to increase the availability of ex-ante financing. And as part of that, to actually have a more proactive exploration in terms of how do we increase the availability of insurance protection, particularly for those who are who need it the most. And so I think that that was quite an incredible development when you think about the G7 communique releasing such a statement. In addition to that, we also have seen the vulnerable group of 20 countries. These are a collective of the most vulnerable countries in the world, releasing a communique again in July, which spoke very clearly to the protection gap and the need to really start to work more proactively with industry, public and private sector to improve the availability of risk and resilience information, but fundamentally to start to develop new solutions that are needed. And then finally, we also have the emergence of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership, which is a partnership between the V20, the G7, and the G20 countries, really focused on extending and making available insurance coverage and risk management solutions to 500 million people by 2025. So I think that that gives a clear steer in terms of the importance of this conversation at this time, given what governments are having to contend with. At the same time, we're also seeing quite a bit of innovation in this space. Right now, there's been, I think, quite interesting developments in terms of risk pools, leveraging parametric insurance solutions, for example, in the Caribbean, where you have the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, where you have governments pooling their risk into a single portfolio to access insurance markets at more competitive rates, and also leveraging the parametric insurance models. Similar things in Africa with the drought risk pool in the Pacific region. And then also at a national level, many governments really begin to explore this question of parametric insurance, risk pooling kind of solutions, and just insurance generally in terms of deepening resilience. So I hope that these examples provide some steer in terms of the conversations that we can have about what does that mean in the context of more developed economies, the United States, and what are the opportunities to do more on that front. And finally, I would say that I often like to frame this issue of the protection gap and what we need to do, and the need for better and more public-private collaboration between the insurance industry and the public sector as really the opportunity to build more effective risk management systems and also protection systems to deal with the kinds of risks that we have to contend with. And for me, this is actually quite an important challenge for us as a global community, for us as national actors to think about what is required. Because when we think about climate change, it's a global challenge. It presents new risks, complex and interconnected risks. There is a demand for risk management services. There is a demand for the kinds of solutions that insurers can bring to bear. But at the same time, there's also a need to think about the innovation that is probably also required, because for the kinds of risks that we're seeing, it often will require, I think, more robust conversations between the public sector and the industry to design solutions that are appropriate. I think it also warrants some reflection in terms of how do we ensure appropriate regulation to deal with the kinds of products that we are seeing emerging. How do we leverage technology effectively to drive the solutions that are needed for the future? So in concluding, I will just say that one of the big things that I think is going to emerge, or is already emerging, is the need for greater and better partnerships and coalitions that can help us to focus on what the problems are, to bring transparency to these risks, but to also drive the kinds of solutions that are needed that really add value to the broader public financial management processes, but also the individuals, particularly those who are most vulnerable, can provide them with the solutions that are needed. So I will conclude by just saying you can find more on the work of the IDF on our website, which is on this slide. But also we have a number of publications that we have released speaking to a variety of themes which are related to the protection gap. Some of these include a practical guide to insuring public assets, to another publication that's focused on the development impact of risk analytics. And I hope that this also provides, hopefully, more information, food for thought, as we think about the kinds of solutions that are needed when we reflect on climate change and the world that we are faced with, but obviously might have to contend with if we are not able to keep to 1.5 degrees. So I'll stop here, and just again to say thank you, Commissioner Kreidler and the team, for the invitation to really be part of this session today. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations.